Hi everyone. Today we're going to be presenting on the topic of gendered speech, so thanks for listening in.
Yeah, so our topic was gendered speech, as Sarah just previously mentioned. And so when we were doing our interview, we focused on a few key concepts that we wanted to bring up in our questions. So our first questions were based on personal pronoun use, how our interviewee used watashi, atashi, boku, etc. Other pronouns were also mentioned. And we also focused on how joseigo and danseigo are defined and how those are used in Japanese. And we also focus on how joseigo and danseigo use impacts and is used in daily communication and daily communication styles. So, yeah.
So our interviewee is actually a student at MSU. She's a young adult female from the Kamakura area, and she says that she tends to speak in Kansai-ben when she's speaking with other native Japanese speakers. She lived in Japan for 9 years, from elementary school to middle school, but today she still speaks with a lot of native speakers, usually friends her age.
So our first insight from our interview was gendered speech is not necessarily a marker of someone's gender identity. So in Japanese, uh, gendered speech can be used very fluently. For instance, in one of our readings in class, mentioned how some younger women, particularly in middle school, used danseigo, like typical danseigo, like boku, ore-sama, stuff like that. So you can see here, like obviously, it's not a matter of like what sex you are. You have to say you're a woman, you have to speak joseigo. That's not necessarily the case, and our interviewee made that pretty clear. Um, and so in English, we have this sort of conscious decision about our pronouns. For instance, when someone's considering their gender identity and they view themselves as a female, they might use she, her, or other pronouns like that. But um, in Japanese, there's not that sort of like conscious decision to use gender pronouns. And one reason why is because you don't necessarily refer to somebody else using pronouns. Rather, you say like anata if you're close with them or just their name. So unlike in English where we say like she, they, him. Um, so our interviewee just kind of said that like we view these pronouns as just like a way of saying I and not necessarily a way of expressing our identity. Um, and she also said that one of her friends uses boku and ore as a woman, and she says she perceives that as like kind of like iffy, like weird, but it's like still okay because in the end it's like your choice. But by choice, it doesn't necessarily mean like this is like an intentional, conscious decision to use these pronouns. And we'll get more into that on the next slide.
Yeah, so when going over the interview myself, I kind of noticed how our interviewee mentioned how gendered speech is more of an automatic response rather than a choice when using Japanese. So it almost seems like gendered speech is kind of ingrained within the Japanese language and perceived as a part of speaking Japanese rather than just a stylistic choice. So a person using joseigo wouldn't consciously think, oh, I have to use atashi, or I have to use a certain pronoun, or oh, I have to end my sentences with wa. Stuff like that is not really thought of. It's more just kind of automatic. And because of that, joseigo and danseigo usage is typically situational or conditional within conversations. So how this works is it depends on your in-group, your out-groups. If you're with friends, close friends, you will have more liberty to speak freely compared to if you're with coworkers or with someone above you. You might try to you might try to just automatically, because of the situation you're in, use joseigo or danseigo to respond to that situation. And you can see this conditional situational use throughout conversations and throughout our interview when we were asking our interviewee. She mentioned how on the news, when it's very informative and very directed at just trying to be true, joseigo use and danseigo use is typically not used because it is perceived as like maybe just a little bit more like a little bit emotional compared to just standard Japanese. While there might be other usages in regular speech or in anime or manga where it's more prominent because it's trying to build a character. And because of this, you can see that it's more conditional and situational, the usage, and it's not really ingrained in thinking about how to use language like English typically. So yeah.
One last insight we got from this interview was that not only does gendered speech change day to day, but it can also change as you age. We saw our interviewee, Mana, describing her and her brother using the old man pronoun washi to make jokes. And it seemed that even though she knew that this was generally considered for older and male people, um, they saw it more as a pronoun that carried a certain weight and personality with it rather than something that was specifically gendered. And so when they wanted to make a certain joke, they would use this pronoun. She also noted a trend in women specifically where older women used a lot more of joseigo, as we spoke about it in class, where they were using like feminine pronouns, wa, kashira, whereas younger women tended to use masculine pronouns to the extent that it seems that a woman speaking with danseigo can be considered somewhat immature, while joseigo is considered a bit more mature and womanly rather than just feminine. And so this is an interesting kind of dichotomy that we can look at. And it opens up the question, like, are these women switching to joseigo because they're getting older, or is it because joseigo comes from their time period? Like that's how they use the language this whole time. It's just that the young people today don't use it that way anymore. So that's pretty interesting, and it was really fun to learn about.
Yeah, thank you all for watching our presentation. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.